All right, we're gonna start, Ajani. I'm going to continue with the mole concept, right? Because as I said, it's a lot to do. A lot, right? But if you're learning the concepts and you're comfortable as you go along, then there shouldn't be anything that you're asked that you can't manage. So today we're going to learn about using mole ratios. So that is our topic today. So, coming. So more calculations. Using mole ratios. All right. All right, so the mole ratio is used when dealing with, so I hope you're copying off the notes, Ajani. So
Yes,
the mole ratio is used when dealing with equations and compounds. It allows us to use one substance to tell us about another. All right. For example, magnesium solid reacts with 2HCl AQ to give NgCl2 plus hydrogen gas. You have an equation like this. You can look for the numbers in front of look for the numbers in front of each substance in equation and write down the number beneath it. So in this case here, because there's nothing in front of the magnesium, we assume that there's a number 1. We normally don't write the number 1, but there's nothing in front of an element or a compound, assume there's a number 1. And then we write a colon, and then in front of the HCl there's a 2, and then in front of this we don't have anything, so that is a 1 as well, and in front of the hydrogen is a 1. So from this equation we can see a mole ratio of 1 to 2 to 1 to 1, and I'll explain what the mole ratios mean. So the mole ratio tells the proportion that the substance should react in. Alright. So it tells the proportion that the substances should react in. For example, from the equation we see there, magnesium and HCl reacts in a 1 to 2 ratio. This means that whatever the number of moles of Mg you have, you will need 2 times that amount of HCl. All right. Let me give you a chance to be able to copy that section, and then I'll discuss it with you some more. So let me give you a few minutes to copy that. Are you finished, Ajani? Or do you need more time?
Wait, miss, I'm almost done. I'm at the last paragraph.
Okay.
Yes, miss, I'm free. Miss, I'm done now.
Okay. So let me go back over what we're discussing. So you're learning about something known as the mole ratio. As it says here, the mole ratio is used when you're dealing with equations and compounds, and it allows us to use one substance to tell us about another. For example, in the reaction where magnesium is reacting with HCl to give MgCl2, you see that it takes 2 of the HCl to react with 1 magnesium. So in that case, the ratio is 1 to 2 to 1 to 1. So the importance of learning about the mole ratio is that it tells us the proportion. Oh, I had a section here repeated. It tells us the proportion that substances should react in. So basically from this equation down here, it says that there is a 1 to 2 ratio between magnesium and the HCl. That means that whatever amount of moles of magnesium you have, you would need 2 times that amount of HCl to completely react. So I'm going to now use this principle of mole ratio now on the next slide to work out a question. Same, we're going to use that same equation there. Using the mole ratio, determine so I want you to use the molar ratio to determine the mass of HCl that would react completely with 15 grams of magnesium. And the Rmm of magnesium is 24, hydrogen is 1, and chlorine is 35.5. Let me allow you to copy the question so we can work through the solution together. Copy down the question and then we work on the solution. Okay, guys, so let us solve this question now. So there's a part of it that you just missed, Krista. I had the explanation about what the mole ratio was about. So the equation we had before that we are using is that when magnesium reacts with HCl, it takes 2 HCl to react with 1 magnesium. And that gives us a 1 to 2 to 1 to 1 ratio. So in this question, they're asking us how much HCl would it take to completely react with 15 grams of magnesium? So first thing you're gonna do is to, I'm trying to give you some steps to guide you. So step 1, start with the substance you have the most information about. Determine the number of moles of that substance. So I'm just kind of trying to give you a guide or a template by which you can do your mole concept questions because they're going to get more complicated as we go on. So in this question, they're asking us about HCl and they're asking us about magnesium. They didn't give us any information about the HCl, but they told us that we had 15 grams of magnesium. So magnesium is the one we know more about. So that's why we're going to start our calculations with magnesium. And they gave us the mass of magnesium. And if we have the mass of a substance, that allows us to work out the moles of that substance. So as soon as we can, we need to try to convert whatever information they give us into moles. because this ratio is only works with moles because this is a mole ratio that we are determining. So we are going to start off by finding the number of moles of magnesium, because that is the one that we have enough information about. So we are going to write back our equation for how do we find the number of moles of something. Moles is equal to the mass given divided by the RMM. So for magnesium, it would be equal to the 15 grams that they gave us divided by the RMM, which is 24 grams per mole. We work out how many moles we have. So 15 divided by 24 would be 0.625 moles. And then our next step, would be to work out, use the mole ratio to tell us about the HCl. So that would be step 2. So we use the mole ratio to determine the number of moles of HCl. So the ratio between magnesium and HCl is 1 to 2. That means that if we had 0.0625 moles of HCl, of magnesium, sorry, then we would need 2 times that amount of HCl. Because of how the ratio, because of what the ratio says. And if we had 2 times that amount, that means that we would need 1.25 moles 1.25 moles of HCl is what we would need in order to completely react with that 15 grams of magnesium. And there's one more step that you'd have to do in order to finish this question, and that would be to convert the mole that you determined into mass. So convert moles of HCl to mass. So this step 3, I wait until you're finished copying it before I can skip the page and look at how we would do the last step. So let me allow you a chance to write it off, and I'll go back through it again, and then we'll go to what would be the third step. Give it another 2 minutes. Let me go back through what the question is about, right? And I hope you can kind of understand the principle of what to do. So whenever you are dealing with a chemical equation, when you have two or more substances reacting with each other, these substances over here are called the reactants, and they are moving over here to form products. Now, based on when you're finished balancing the equation, any number that is in front of these substances, you can write it beneath it, and that will give us something known as a mole ratio. So in the case of magnesium, there was no number in front of it. So we assumed that there was a 1. There was a 2 in front of the HCl, so that's why we wrote the 2. There was nothing in front of this one, so we wrote the 1, and there was nothing here, so we wrote the 1. So when we were finished, we had a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1 to 1. Basically, this is telling us the proportion or the relationship in which the substances react. So basically, any amount of magnesium we have, we know that it will take 2 times that amount of HCl to react with that magnesium. Now, in this question, they're asking us to use this knowledge of mole ratio to see how much HCl, what is the mass of HCl that it would take to react with 15 grams of magnesium. And I gave you the RMM values down here, right? So I am kind of giving you a guide for whenever you're doing mole concept questions. That anytime you're asked a question in mole concept, you have to look carefully at the question to see what substance did they give you more of the information about, and start doing your calculations with that substance. In this case, they didn't tell us anything about the HCl, but at least they gave us the mass of the magnesium. So that means that magnesium was the one we knew more about. So that is the one we would start our calculations with. And one of the first things that you want to do in your mole equation, in your mole calculations, is that they will give you information, but they're not going to always give you the mole, and you should always try to convert any information that you're given into the mole. So that mass that they gave us, that 15 grams of magnesium, we should try to convert that 15 grams into mole, so that we can then start to use our mole ratio, and we can use the magnesium to tell us about the other substances in the equation. So remember, the equation that we use to find the mole of a substance is that we look at the mass that is given divided by the RMM of that substance. So we were given 15 grams of magnesium, and the RMM of magnesium is 24 grams per mole. So when we divided it, we got the mole to be 0.625 of the magnesium. Now, once we know how many moles of magnesium we have, we can use the mole ratio to tell us about the other substances in that equation. So the question only asks us about HCl, so that is why I never wrote back the other two substances in the equation. I just wrote the relationship between the magnesium and the HCl, and the relationship was a 1 to 2 relationship. So 0.625 moles of magnesium would mean that we would have 2 times the 2.625 of HCl, because the mole ratio is saying that whatever magnesium we have, we need 2 times that amount of HCl. So when we multiply that number by 2, we get 1.25 moles. So far, we know that we would need 1.25 moles of HCl to react with the 0.625 moles of magnesium. But the question didn't ask us to find out the moles of HCl. It asked us to find out the mass of HCl. So that means that we still have to do another step and use this mole that we have found and convert it into mass. So I'm going to do that other part over here, step 3, and see how we would convert the moles into mass. So whenever you are trying to find the mass of something, mass is equal to, all we're doing is just changing this equation around to make mass the subject. So mass is of a substance is equal to the moles times the RMM of the substance. So this one equation, we can just shift it up around, shift it in another way. And we, instead of having moles as the subject, we can make mass the subject. So we are interested now in finding the mass of HCl. And for us to tell the mass of HCl, we would need the mole, which we just calculated down here, to be 1.25 mole. And then we need to multiply it by the RMM of HCl. So I want for you to work out for me what is the RMM of HCl so that I can put it into the equation, please. So let's just do the, let's work out the RMM in a little box to the side. So guys, what would be the RMM of this compound? It has one hydrogen atom in it, and the hydrogen is 1. And it has 1 chlorine in it, and that's 35.5. So we add those together, we will get 36.5. And the units of RMM is grams per mole. So I would now put that information in, that 36.5 grams per mole, and work out the mass of HCl. And that would give me a total of 45.625 grams. So we have successfully been able to answer the question asked of us. Now, these questions can be very long, multi-step questions. That's why I'm trying to teach you the principle of how you approach these questions, right? If you have a principle, you can always find your way through it. So after I finish doing my calculations, I will write one sentence to make a conclusion. So my conclusion in this case is that 15 grams of magnesium requires 45.625 grams of HCl to react. I want you to tell me if you understand the steps I did. Is there anything that you're unclear that is unclear to you that you want me to repeat? Is there anything that you want me to repeat, or do you understand the steps that I did to do the calculations? I take it that you understood the steps I did. So I'm going to give you a similar question, similar principles, and I want you to work it out. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes or 15 minutes to work it out to see if you can apply the principles for yourself. So I'm going to write it over this side. Did you copy this side already, guys?
Mhm.
All right, so I'm going to erase this side, and I'm going to write a question that is very similar to the one we did. Similar principles. You should be able to follow and be able to work it out. So question over this side. Question. Determine the mass of CO2 formed when sodium carbonate reacts with, I hope you have the periodic tables because you're going to have to work out these RMMs for yourself, with sulfuric acid according to when, sorry, 10 grams, when 10 grams reacts with the following equation. So sodium carbonate reacts with H2SO4 to form sodium sulfate plus CO2 plus water. Let me write this better. Plus CO2 plus water. And from this equation, I can derive the ratios here. 1, everything is reacting in it. 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. So they're basically telling us that they have supplied us with 10 grams of this substance, and they're asking us to see how much of the CO2 we could get from that 10 grams. If we give you 10 grams of sodium carbonate, how much CO2 could you form? What mass of CO2 could you form? Now, I want you to attempt to do this question, and you have to go through the 3 steps that I went through for the previous question. So sometimes you will get a mole concept question. It's not a simple thing as just doing one calculation. You have to do more than 1 steps. So follow the 3 steps I did in the previous one to see if you can work it out. So remember, first thing you have to do, start off with the substance they gave you most of the information about, which was the sodium carbonate. They told you that you had 10 grams of it, but you can't do anything with the grams doesn't say much to you. You have to convert these grams into mole first. And then according to the ratio, there is a ratio of 1 to 1. So between the sodium carbonate and the CO2, there's a ratio of 1 to 1. So whatever amount of moles of sodium carbonate you have, that is the same amount of moles of CO2 that you will have. So once you convert this into moles, then you will know how many moles of CO2 you would need, and then you will have to convert that moles of CO2 into mass of CO2, right? Let me give you 10 minutes to copy and do the calculation for this question, and then we'll discuss it, okay? All right, guys. I hope you had enough time to attempt it for yourself. So I'm going back. I had just gone back to this slide so that Christoph could see what he missed. So I'm going back to the question that was asked. And I'm depending on you now, between the two of you, to guide me as to what I'm to do to solve the question that was asked. So, what is the mass of carbon dioxide that would be formed if you use 10 grams of sodium carbonate to react with sulfuric acid? Well, really, they didn't tell us how much sulfuric acid, but I guess they just want us to know how much CO2 we can produce from the sodium carbonate. So what would be the first thing that you would advise me to do, guys? What's the
Find
first
the RMM
of what? Of which
of
compound?
sodium carbonate.
All right, let us do that because that's the one they gave us the most information about. So what did you get for the RMM for this compound?
Oh, miss, I didn't work that out.
Ajani, did you work it out? Ajani?
Miss, would it be 106?
Let us see. So what is the RMM of the sodium? So we have 2 sodiums, right? Plus 1 carbon plus 3 oxygens. So we just need to put in the values for each one. So what is the RMM of sodium? 1 sodium. Yeah, I told you if you're doing the mole concept, you have to have a periodic table that you're working with. So what is the value for the RMM of sodium?
It's 23.
23.
20 what?
3.
3.
All right, so we have 2 times 23. What's the RMM of carbon?
12.
12. All right, so there are certain elements, when you do enough of these calculations, you're gonna start remembering the RMMs, right? And the oxygen?
16.
16. So let's see, so that will be 46 plus 12 plus 48. And you said it comes to 106, Ajani?
Yes.
All right. Okay, that is correct. So the RMM of the sodium carbonate is 106 grams per mole. All right. So I found my RMM. So what else should I do now?
Miss, find the RMM of CO2.
Well, you could do that, but I wouldn't necessarily do that no, because there's something else I need to do with the sodium carbonate.
Would you divide it?
We need to find the moles because they gave us the mass. So let us find the
10
moles.
grams.
Yeah, the mass was 10 grams, but we have to convert it into moles. So let us find the moles of sodium carbonate. So what is the equation for moles again?
Oh, miss, to convert it to moles, would you just divide the RMM and the mass given?
So yes, so we are using the equation. So moles is equal to
Means it would be the mass over the molar mass.
mass over molar mass or mass over RMM. All right. So as you said, Christoph and Ajani, the mass that we were given was 10 grams, and we worked out the RMM to be 106 grams per mole. So when we divide them, we should get our mole. And that would give us 0.094 moles of sodium carbonate. Okay. So what do I do next now?
Wait, did the same for the CO2.
All right, so you want me to find the RMM of CO2, no problem. So let's find RMM of CO2, which would be 12 plus 2 times 16, right? And that would work out to be 44. All right. So I found the Rmm of CO2. What next should I do?
Miss, find the moles of CO2.
Okay, so how am I going to find the moles of the CO2 now?
Mass over.
We can't use that, because we don't have a mass for the CO2. The question didn't give us a mass. So if we know we have the iron, but they didn't give us a mass. So how can we find the moles? And we don't have a mass, because that's what the question wants us to give them, wants us to give them the mass of CO2. So how do we get a mole for the CO2 now? Any ideas? Remember that the mole ratio is to assist you that if you found out the moles of one substance in the equation, you can use that one substance to tell you the moles of any other substance in the equation. That's the relevance of learning the mole ratios. Okay, so being that we have spent the time and we worked out the number of moles of sodium carbonate, then we can use this information about sodium carbonate to tell us about any other substance which is in the equation. We just need to know what is the ratio between the sodium carbonate and that other substance. So at this point, that is when you're going to use your knowledge of the mole ratio. So we are interested in learning what is the relationship between sodium carbonate and CO2. So based on the equation over here, what is the ratio between sodium carbonate and CO2, guys?
Miss 1 to 1.
1 to 1. So 1 sodium carbonate, so 1 CO2. That's the relationship or the ratio. So now we are going to use that relationship. So if we worked out that we had 0.094 moles of sodium carbonate, then it follows that because the relationship is a 1-to-1 relationship, that it's the same amount of moles of CO2 that would be formed. So that is how we would be able to get a moles for the CO2 by using this ratio. So now we have the moles of the CO2. How we just need to do the last thing and tell them what mass of CO2. So we are now at the last step of the whole thing. So step 3 would be to find the mass of CO2, because that's what they asked for. Find mass of CO2. And what equation are we going to use to find the mass of the CO2? What equation can we use to find mass, guys?
Mole times Rmm.
Alrighty. So mass is equal to the mole times the RMM. And we now have both pieces of information, so it shouldn't be hard for us to find the mass. So the mole we said would be 0.094 moles, and we had already worked out RMM to be 44 grams per mole. So that means the mass would be the mass would work out to be 4.136 grams. And then we just want to make our concluding statement. Let us make our conclusion now. So our conclusion would be 10 grams of sodium carbonate would produce 4.136 Let's round it off. 4.2 grams of CO2. Okay. So I'm giving you a chance to copy this off, and then I'm going to give you a 10-minute break. We're going to do another one just to make sure that we're comfortable with this. So copy this off, and then by 4:50, we will resume, okay? With another question.
Miss,
Yes?
for step 2,
Mm-hmm.
why do you have to find the Rmm of CO2?
Well, we would have needed to do it down here. When we were trying to find the mass, we have to know the moles and the RMM to find the mass. So we could have done it with step 3, but Ajani had suggested that we find it because we would need to find it anyway. Because we would need it for the next step coming up. Because you can't find the mass unless you have the RMM and the mole. So we had to work with the RMM of the CO2.
Oh, can you find the Rmm of anything on the right side? Or does it have to be a specific one?
No, you can find the RMM of any compound. You just need to look at the elements in the compound and look at the periodic table for what each one is and add them up.
Same thing for step 3. You can use anyone.
What do you mean by anyone? Let us work what we
on the right side.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
it says any.
Mm-hmm. Sodium carbonate and the sulfuric acid, right? Those are on the left side. Those are the reactants. Mm-hmm. And then you're asking
And then on the right side, you have Na2SO4, CO2, and H2O.
Yeah.
So could you use any of those?
Well, yeah, they could have asked us about any of them, but the question specifically asked you about CO2. So you couldn't be using water. You couldn't be using the information for water when they're asking you about CO2. So if they had asked you about the Na2SO4, then you would have worked out the RMM of the Na2SO4. Or if they had asked you how much water would you produce, then you would have worked with the RMM of water. But they specifically asked about the CO2, which is why you would have done your RMM of CO2 specifically and worked out the moles, the mass of CO2 specifically that you would form. So I guess what you're asking is that they can give you information about any substance in the equation and ask you to link it to any other one. And what you need is a mole ratio so that you can link them together.
Yes, miss.
All right. So let me give you guys a 10-minute break and then we'll do another one. To resume now, I want you to do one more question for the chem. We go to the biology. One more thing to make sure you really understand this, the use of the mole concept. So I'm going to give you another question, but this time I'm going to give you less time because I'm hoping that now you would have seen the steps. Okay. So here's another question. So calculate the mass of sulfuric acid required to react with 15 grams of sodium hydroxide. So I'm going to be kind and provide you with a chemical equation for how sodium hydroxide. I'm going to balance the equation for you, but you're going to have to derive the mole ratios for yourself. I hope you guys are back. Johnny and Christoph?
I'm here, miss.
Okay. Because I'm just giving you guys about 10 minutes to solve this question here. So when sulfuric acid and sodium hydroxide reacts, they form sodium sulfate and water. So that's, I've given you the balanced equation. So you can derive the mole ratio once you are supplied with a balanced equation. So they want to know how much, what mass of sulfuric acid would it take to react with 15 grams of sodium hydroxide. So 10 minutes to work this. Remember that this usually is usually has 3 steps. So don't expect to just do one calculation and get your answer. So I'm giving you 10 minutes, guys. 39 or 40?
Oh,
This is
yes,
23,
40.
40, yes, yes. So the 2 is not, the 2 does not affect the RMM. The 2 is just there to balance the equation. So that
Okay.
is mostly to derive the mole ratio.
Okay.
Okay. Ready to tell me how to answer the question, or do you need more time? Guys, do you need more time, or are you ready to answer the question?
Time.
I
More
didn't hear.
time.
Okay. All right. So you can start by telling us what to do first, Christoph.
So the ratio would be
Okay.
2,
Mm-hmm.
2 to 1, to 1
Mm-hmm.
to 2.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Then number of moles equal mass given over RMM.
Mm-hmm. So which one are you finding the most for? Which substance are you finding the most for? All right, go ahead and tell me what.
NaOH.
Okay, so you, because that's the one they gave you this information for, right? So we're
Yes,
finding for the NaOH. Okay. All right, so what's the RMM of the NaOH?
40.
40. And they gave us a mass of 15 grams. So 15 grams divided by the 40 grams per mole.
0.375 moles.
Okay. You got that, Ajani? You work out this mole, Ajani?
I did something wrong. Instead of 40, I put 48.
Oh, okay. All right. But most times when you get these questions, once you're doing the right principles, even when you might get the answer wrong, you'll still be awarded marks once you are doing the right thing. All right, so after we found the moles of sodium hydroxide, what do we do next?
You find the RMM of H2SO4.
Okay. And how much did you get for that?
100 GMOL, grams per mole.
100 exactly. You sure? Because this is 2 times. This is 2. 2 times the hydrogen is 2. Hydrogen is 1, so it's 2 of them. So that's 2. The sulfur is 32 and 64.
Oh yeah, 98 times.
So this is 98. All right. So what do we do next now?
The mole ratio.
Between what?
NaOH and H2SO4.
Okay. And the ratio is 2 to 1, as you said. Next.
Okay, so it'd be 2 times 0.375 moles.
Wait.
0.75.
All right, so this is saying that whatever amount of sodium hydroxide we have, half of that will be for the sulfuric acid, half of that amount. So this is a 2 to 1 ratio. That means that the sodium hydroxide is always going to be 2 times the amount of the sulfuric acid. So what you should do is divide it by 2, not multiply. So if the sulfuric acid is 0.375 moles, then the H2SO4 is 0.375 divided by 2. So that would give us 0.1875. So now that we have the moles of sulfuric acid, that means we can do the last part. We do the final step now. Guys, what's the last step?
Oh, mass equals mole times RMM.
All right. So mass of sulfuric acid is equal to the moles times the RMM, and that would be now the 0.1875 moles that we just got up there times the 98 that we got up there. So that would be 18.375 grams. Okie dokie. So you can make your corrections to your information. Whatever corrections you need to make. And another 3 minutes, then we're going to run through some of the biology. I finish copying what you need to answer and stuff. I want you to go back to when we just started looking at reproduction in plants, and I told you the steps. I think it was about 10 steps for reproduction in plants, for sexual reproduction in plants. I wanted to see if you can find that list that I gave you and tell me what were the steps. So I'm going to change this slide. So I wanted to find back those notes for biology and tell me what are the steps that a plant would go through in order to carry out sexual reproduction. Go back through and tell me them, please. Find the notes and tell me the steps.
Produce flowers.
So all right, so the plant would produce flowers, yes. And we have gone through the whole aspect of the structure of the flowers already. So we have done this. We've done that first step already. Next step would be what?
Makes pollen.
So what part of the flower makes pollen?
The male gamete.
The male part of the flower. So the pollen is the male gamete. So I'm asking you, what part of the flower makes the male gamete or makes the pollen?
Is the stigma?
No, not the stigma.
Or the style?
No. The male part of the flower is the anther and the filament. So it's the anther that makes the pollen. All right, what was step 3? What do you do after you make the pollen?
Makes ovum.
So that's the female gamete, no? All right, so where in the flower would you make the female gamete? Hmm?
It's in the ovary.
Ovary. Mm-hmm. All right, so what do we do next?
Pollination.
Pollination. All right, do you know what is the definition of pollination?
I think so.
Tell me, please. What do you mean by pollination?
The transfer of pollen from one plant to another.
All right, so sometimes you'd fix up that and you say the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of one plant to another plant of the same species. All right, but I'm going to give you some notes that you can have for this topic. So you can have all the notes for it in one place. I'll send you a folder with the notes. So we had pollination. So what were the types of pollination now? So we did this part already. So I'm just ticking off what we have done so far. But let us dwell a little bit here. What were the types of pollination?
It's, self-pollination.
Mm-hmm.
And
So the plant could be,
cross-pollination.
yes. So we said you could so you would put it into two categories. So you could say it's either self, right, or cross. Which one is better for the plant? For the species, that is.
Miss Cross.
Yes, the cross-pollination is better. No, under cross-pollination, no, we had further subdivided it to say that the plant could use insect. Well, most likely if you're going to use self-pollination, it's going to be insect. But anyway, I'll leave it at insect, or they could just do it themselves. They probably don't even need an insect. They could just bend the anther and just touch the stigma. So if they're going to use self-pollination, they might need insects to help them, or they can just do it by themselves, mechanical. And if you're going to do cross-pollination, that's where we had said you would either need insects or you would need the wind to help you. And then we had
animals. Animals.
Well, animals don't really help with the pollination, you know. They'll help with the dispersal of the seed. But in terms of the pollination, it's usually insects or birds. I would include birds, but I wouldn't just make it so wide and say animals. So I'd say insects or birds. And then what we discussed what were the features of what the flower would have if it was depending on insects to do the pollination for it versus what it would look like if it was using wind to do the pollination. Let us see if we remember those features. So a plant that is going to use insect, how will the flower look in order to attract insects?
The plant would be colorful.
The petals, right? The petals. So you'd want colorful petals, yes. Attract the insects. That's one feature. What else? What else would we want to attract the pollinators?
The
So
smell.
yes, so you'd want to have an aroma. Yes, you'd want it to have a nice strong smell to attract the pollinators. And there's one more thing that the insect, well, not only one thing, they tend to have their stigma and style located on the inside of the flower. And they also tend to have a nectary that produces a sweet nectar that would feed the insects when they come. And while the insects are coming to get the nectar, that is when some of the pollen will fall on their backs. Now let us describe how a wind pollinated flower would look. So how would the petals look for the plant that is wind pollinated? Come on, guys, would the plant that is wind pollinated have big attractive petals?
No, miss.
No. Okay.
The stamens and stigmas would be exposed.
And they would be, yes, so the stamen would be outside, and the stigma would be large and feathery and would also be outside. Yes. And we didn't describe the pollen grains. So the pollen grains for the insect pollinated plant is sticky, but the pollen grain for the wind pollinated plant is smooth. And the wind pollinated plant wouldn't have a nectary, wouldn't produce nectar, wouldn't smell good. All right, so after pollination now, after we manage to get the pollen to get over to the stigma, what is the next step of the process?
Fermentation.
Fertilization, I mean.
Yeah.
So fertilization, and that is where we are at now. So this is where we are at in the process. After fertilization comes what?
Seed development.
Seed development, yes. And then after seed development, what comes next?
Fruit development.
Fruit development. And then?
Seed dispersal.
Seed dispersal. And then?
Seed germination.
And then seed germination. And then I guess the last part was growth, right?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So the reason why I gave you this guideline at the front, at the beginning of the topic, was so that you can be guided, right? To know what are the sequences, or what is the sequence of your steps. So we have done these 4 steps so far. So we are now at number 5 to discuss fertilization. So I know that we're breaking up the topic in different parts each week, but I want you to still have an idea of what we're doing. What is the sequence of what we're doing? So I'm gonna just show you something on pollination and fertilization. So pollination, we discussed it last week, but I'm gonna show you on fertilization as well, and we're gonna go through that step 5 so we can get through step 5 today, the fertilization part.
Hi kids! Today we will learn about pollination and fertilization in plants. So let's start. We learned that all living beings reproduce. That is, all living things give birth to the same kind. And similarly, plants too reproduce their own kind. And most of the plants reproduce through seeds. That is, they produce seeds, which when it germinates and produces a new plant. Let's see how these seeds are produced. We learned the structure of a flower in our last assignment. This is pedicel, which is a green color stalk. Then this broader part is a receptacle, and all other parts are arranged in 4 whorls.
Okay, I didn't realize that this video, okay. So let's continue.
Tootway has thousands of animals. Clear the core basics of.
Sorry guys, we'll just get past that.
Is of green sepals. Second is colorful petals. Third is stamens, which is the male reproductive part. Fourth is carpel or pistil, which is the female reproductive part. Stamen consists of a long stalk called filament and a swollen head called anther. It consists of numerous very small pollens, which are male reproductive cells. Pistil consists of a sticky structure called stigma, attached to a long tube-like structure called style, and style ends in a swollen part called ovary. And this ovary contains the female reproductive cells, ovules. When pollens from the anther of stamen joins with the ovules present in the ovary, we call it fertilization. Let's revise. When pollens from the anther of stamen joins with the ovules present in the ovary, it is called fertilization. And fertilization forms the seeds inside the ovary. And after fertilization, this ovary changes into a fruit. That's why seeds are there inside the fruit. Now let's see what is pollination. Pollination is a process by which pollen is transferred from the anther, that is, the male part, to the stigma, which is the female part of the plant, thereby enabling the fertilization and reproduction in turn. Now let's see how pollination occurs or how pollens reach stigma. There are various ways. How do pollens reach the stigma? Flowers have bright petals and strong fragrance that attract insects and other animals that acts as food.
All right, so I really wanted you to see the fertilization part of it. So, so the whole point about it that I wanted you to see is that once the pollen lands on the stigma, that there's a tube that is going to grow. So I'm going to show you the notes for that. So once the pollen has landed on the stigma, a tube is going to grow. That will transfer the pollen, the gamete inside of the pollen, so that it can get to the ovule, which is inside of the ovary. So this, I'm gonna find that section now. So this is showing you that pollen has landed on the stigma, and once the pollen lands on the stigma, there's a tube that starts to grow from the pollen grain down the style, and the tube will continue until it gets inside here, the ovary, which is where the female gamete is. So fertilization in flowering plants. Let me see if I can pull up the notes for the notes of fertilization for you. Oh, all right. It seems that I didn't get notes for fertilization, so let me go back and get it. All right, so let's go through the steps of fertilization. So it says here that fertilization occurs when a pollen nucleus fuses with an ovum nucleus in the ovule, right? So you have to have fusion of the nucleus in the pollen grain with the ovum nucleus in the ovule. As the pollens have no tail to swim to the ovary, instead, the pollen has to grow a pollen tube. This only happens if the pollen has landed on the right kind of stigma. That is, it has to land on the same species as the flower the pollen came from. The nucleus inside the pollen grain slips down the tube as it grows down the style towards the ovary. The ovary contains one or more ovules, each which each contain an ovum with a female nucleus that a male pollen nucleus can fuse with. Once the nuclei have joined together, that ovule has been fertilized, and we say that a zygote has been formed. A zygote will eventually divide to form a seed within the ovary. As different plants have different numbers of ovules, this explains why different fruits which develop from the ovary have different number of seeds which develop the ovules. Again, they're showing us the pollen grain would land on the stigma, and then the pollen tube would grow down until the nucleus of the male plant can get inside to where the ovum is, because you have to have fusion of the two of them. All right, so the notes. Okay. So the notes were right here, but so the notes for fertilization. So I'm going to send you a document which has some notes. So this is the notes for the fertilization part of it. So once the male gamete has successfully been able to get to the ovum and the two nuclei are allowed to fuse, that is called fertilization. And then that is going to develop into a zygote, and the zygote is going to develop into a seed. So that means that if we go back to our list of what our topics are for bio, we would have seen that fertilization is a quick thing, which we just discussed. And so the next thing we need to talk about is how do we develop the seed. So seed development would be the next process, because we just finished fertilization. So let's just look at that step now, which is how to develop the seed. Sorry. All right, first, before I do that, sorry, I'm going to show you a video of what happens after fertilization takes place. What are the things that are going to happen in the plant after fertilization occurs? That's what I'm going to show you next before I look at seed development. Just waiting on the video to load.
In our previous video, we have taken a look at the process of pollination. Can you recall the process? This process occurs in flowering plants. The pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same or a different flower. We have also taken a look at the different types of pollination: self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now let us see what exactly happens after pollination. The next and the most important step is that of fertilization. Now, what's this process exactly? Fertilization is simply the process of fusion of the male and the female gametes to give rise to a new embryo. Before understanding this process, let's understand these terms which are new for us. Firstly, let's get to know what gametes are. Gametes are the specialized cells which serve the function of reproduction. We find these cells in organisms that carry out sexual reproduction. For now, we only need to know that gametes will be different in the males and the females. And sexual reproduction is where the gametes from both male and female individuals will unite to give a zygote. What is a zygote? It is a single cell structure formed from the fusion of male and female gametes. This single cell further develops into an embryo. And what's an embryo, by the way? It is the structure that will further develop into an organism. So gametes are the special cells called sex cells present in organisms that participate in sexual reproduction. Fusion of the two gametes, one from a male and the other from a female, will give rise to a zygote, which will further develop into an embryo. This embryo grows and develops into a baby organism. These were a few terms that we had to know. Now let's get back to the fertilization process in plants. Let's define it again. It is the process of fusion of male and female gametes to give rise to a new embryo. After pollination is successfully accomplished, how does fertilization occur in plants? Let us zoom into the structure of a typical pistil, the female reproductive part of the flower. The pollination process has caused the pollen grains to safely land on the stigma, which is seen here. For fertilization to occur, the male gametes need to reach this lower part of the pistil called the ovary, where the female gamete awaits it. The female gamete or the egg cell is present inside the ovary. To form a zygote, the female gamete has to fuse with the male gamete. Now, how will this happen? It is made possible by a structure called the pollen tube. This tube is formed from the pollen grain itself. The tube travels down the complete style and ultimately reaches the ovary. The tube carries along the male gamete that is safely taken to the ovary. Now, once the gamete reaches the ovary, the two fuse, giving rise to the formation of a single cell. This is the zygote, and the zygote will further develop into an embryo. Zygote formation in plants marks the completion of fertilization. What happens next? What will happen once fertilization is successfully accomplished? After fertilization, the ovary develops into a fruit and ovules develop into seeds. What's an ovule? An ovule is a part of the female reproductive system that will develop into seeds after fertilization. This is all we need to know for now. We will get into the structure and functions of ovule in higher grades. So getting back, the ovule forms the seeds, which is nothing but a structure containing the embryo inside it. The baby plant. A baby plant that is yet to develop means it needs utmost protection. That is why we have the seed. A seed remains safe and guarded by a seed coat, which protects the inner delicate parts and the embryo during unfavorable conditions. So how does a plant grow from the single seed? When seeds are sown in the soil and when they achieve favorable conditions, they germinate to give us a new plantlet. Now the next question is, how do seeds get rooted every time in the soil? Let us get to know the concept of seed dispersal.
All right, so that was just explaining to you that after you have the male pollen grain, the nucleus of the pollen grain fusing with the nucleus of the ovum, that will give rise to a zygote. A zygote will develop into an embryo, and the embryo is what is found inside of the seed. So inside of the seed is a developing embryo. Now, so I'm going to, let's discuss the notes now for the formation of a seed, which is the next step in the process where we're at now. So it says here that a fertilized ovule will divide by mitosis to form a seed, which contains the embryo plant and food stores called cotyledons. So the main structure of a seed is as seen here. So it would have a seed coat. Then inside of it, it will have food stores. So there would be an endosperm. Some seeds have an endosperm and some seeds have cotyledons. And both of these function to store food for the developing embryo. So right here, this is the embryo. An embryo has two main parts. So there is a young shoot known as a plumule, and there is a young root known as a radicle. So this is the main structure of a seed. There's the embryo that has a young shoot and a young root. There are cotyledons. Some seeds have one cotyledon, and they are known as monocotyledonous seeds. And there are some seeds that have two cotyledons are known as dicotyledonous seeds. And then you can have extra storage of food called an endosperm, and then you have a seed coat. So the wall of the ovule forms a seed coat, which is also known as a tester. And the ovary, where the ovule was located, will develop into a fruit, which may be fleshy, for example, plum, or it may be a dry fruit like peas or lupin. So this is another diagram showing us a seed. So we would have the seed coat outside, then the storage for food is the cotyledon, and then this would be the young embryo inside here. So there is a young shoot up here and the young root, which is called the radicle. And usually seeds have one tiny hole known as a micropyle, and that tiny hole is to facilitate the entry of water into the seed so that the seed can germinate and grow. Okay. After the seed has been formed, if the seed is actually, if it actually gets landed in a very favorable area, then the next thing that the seed will do is that it will germinate. But before we can actually speak about germination, we need to look at another process that comes before that, which is fruit development. So we have just looked at fertilization and we just did seed development. So basically we are now at number 7 in the process, which is to describe fruit development and seed dispersal. So I think we can get through the fruit development part, and then what we'll do next week, we'll speak about the germination aspect after. I'm going to just show you something about the fruit development in a minute. Just give me 1 minute to pull that up. So we are now at that stage. Really on fruit development.
A fruit fruit consists of seeds enclosed in a mature ovary of a flowering plant. When the eggs in the ovules of an apple flower have been fertilized, the petals, stamens, and upper portion of the pistils wither and fall away. The walls of the ovary in an apple harden, and the supporting stem becomes fleshy and grows up and around the ovary as the seeds develop inside each ovule. The remains of the sepals can be seen at the end of the fruit. The fruit is attached to the plant at the opposite or stem end of the fruit.
So let me just rotate again.
A fruit consists of seeds enclosed in a mature ovary of a flowering plant. When the eggs in the ovules of an apple flower have been fertilized, the petals, stamens, and upper portion of the pistils wither and fall away. The walls of the ovary in an apple harden, and the supporting stem becomes fleshy and grows up and around the ovary as the seeds develop inside each ovule. The remains of the sepals can be seen at the end of the fruit. The fruit is attached to the plant at the opposite or stem end of the fruit.
All right. So basically what they're saying to us is that after we have had successful fertilization while the seed is developing, the ovary that surrounds the seed is also going to undergo some changes so that it can become the fruit. So the fruit is really formed to protect the seeds that are inside of it. And the fruits can become fleshy so that they can attract animals that will pick and eat the fruit and hopefully help to spread the seeds. So when we start our next class, what I will do is go through the notes for fruit development, and then we'll go on to talk about seed dispersal, and we'll just continue with the list. So basically, once we have done all the different components of this list, then we can say that we have completed sexual reproduction in plants, and then we could look at sexual reproduction in humans. So remember that we have stopped at this section, seed development. So for next class, we're going to start off with the fruit development, and we'll continue down till we can finish this up. All right, so that's where we're going to stop today, guys. Do you have any questions? Do you have any questions before we go? No? All righty. So enjoy the rest of your evening.